Please be seated. And let's bow our heads together. Holy One, we are a people frightened for the future of the country we love. We have trouble sleeping. We have trouble talking to friends and family members who see things differently. We have trouble knowing what, if anything, we can do. But this much we take as an article of faith. We have been here before, and somehow we turn the tables on those who would run our nation as one would run a crime syndicate. We recognize before it's too late that the hour was already late, and we turned ourselves around. Some are saying it's already too late, but we know how often those who claim to know the future are wrong. If the moral arc of the universe is long but bends towards justice, as Dr. King put it, we are desperate to see something, anything that looks like a bend. Help us to stay on the long and stony road that leads to peace and justice. Peace and justice. And just for the record, we are never going to stop using those words. Grant us wisdom, grant us courage for the living of these days. Amen. And let us say together the version of the Lord's Prayer that is printed in your bulletin. Our Creator, who is in heaven, holy is your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our debts as we forgive our debtors. Do not let us fall into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For you reign in the power that is love, now and always. Amen. A group of us have been studying this little book, 10 Poems to Change Your Life, by Roger Housden, and we are at week 7, if you can believe that. We have only one more poem to go after this, and then I'm trying to preach a sermon on the poem we just studied. And this one is written by Derek Walcott, and it's called Love After Love, and the text is in your bulletin. The time will come when, with elation, you will greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, "Sit here, eat." You will love again the stranger who was yourself. Give wine, give bread, give back your heart to itself, to the stranger who has loved you all your life, whom you ignored for another, who knows you by heart. Take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes. Peel your image from the mirror. Sit, feast on your life. Here ends this reading of this poem, inspired by God. May God grant to us wisdom and courage for interpretation. Derek Walcott, who hails from St. Lucia in the Caribbean, won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1992. He's famous for writing long poems, although this one isn't, that embody the tension of having grown up in these two cultures, that of the island itself and that of its British rulers. But in this poem, he's celebrating a different tension, that between two selves who suddenly pass one another in a moment of recognition, greet one another, and in a moment of exuberance, each invites the other to a sacramental meal. It does not matter who you are. In this poem, we return again to the most familiar theme of all the poems we've read and studied together. You may have noticed, those of you in the class, and that's most of you, namely, the alienation of the true self from what we might call the habitual self. In different ways, our poets so far have tried to tell us that our public self, our busy self, our multitasking, competitive, recognition-seeking self is not our true self. It is not our soul. When I was a child, I saw a bumper sticker on a car one day that said, "I fight poverty, I work." I remember thinking, even at the time, that this was an arrogant oversimplification, but also a deep and deadly illusion in Western culture. It presumes that all anyone has to do is try harder, and that ultimately we can all make ourselves into whatever we wish to become. Those who have failed have only failed themselves, and the best way to help others is to help yourself. This is essentially the view of human nature that undergirds free market capitalism and the autonomy of the individual. We are all self-made women and men, we think. We all made our money the old-fashioned way, as Smith Barney used to say. We earned it. Actually, the truth is the old-fashioned way to make money is to inherit it. But I digress. We prefer this myth of the rugged individual because it helps us to deal with the guilt we might otherwise feel if we were to confront the fact that many are born into circumstances so desperately broken that they have nothing approaching the chance that many of us had to make it in the world. And we like to think we did it all by ourselves, but nothing could be further from the truth. I was born a white male into an intact family that surrounded me with love and support. I never doubted that I was loved, which is the greatest gift that any child can receive. No one ever looked at me and hated me for the color of my skin or leered at me as if I were an object to be possessed. I grew up in a family of language and conversation, of political involvement, and was taught the importance of ideas. I did not make myself. I am not self-made. That is a myth. I simply recognized a path laid out for me from birth. I unfolded into a life that was a gift to me to begin with, not an accomplishment on my part. I say this not to presume that everything is predetermined, because I believe that our choices still matter, but rather to join in the spirit of this poem by acknowledging that much of what we become in this life was there from the beginning, a true self that was embryonic, or as Jeremiah puts it, by speaking in the voice of the Lord, "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you, and before you were born, I consecrated you." Now, as you all know, those who oppose abortion in any and all circumstances have tried to make us believe that this is what Jeremiah is talking about. It isn't. It's about the authentic self, the soul, what was present from the beginning and is blessed. Just as the oak tree is already present in the acorn, my right-handedness, my sexuality, my extroversion, my sense of the world as open and available and welcoming to me were all present from the moment I first cried, and somebody picked me up. I did nothing to earn it, and this world would be a more humble and compassionate place if we could just get over ourselves. Narcissism is the enemy of authenticity, and the very soul of our country is threatened by it. It's the art of the deal over the humility of the moral imagination. Walcott says in his poem that even our joys and our trials were present from the beginning. The rabbis used to have this wonderful story. They would teach that when you are about to be born, God takes you to a field covered with bundles, and each bundle represents a particular set of troubles. You can choose any of the bundles, but the one you choose you have to take to earth with you. The rabbis say that if, at the moment of death, God were to take you back to that field and let you consider another bundle with which to relive your life, you would always pick the same one again. Now, this might also be true of the bundles of joys, but the illusion we carry around with us is that we have to think up what we have to do every day, when in fact, who you are is largely present from the beginning. Your task is not to make yourself, but rather to recognize yourself. Once, years ago, I drove up to my hometown, which is Wichita, Kansas, to give a lecture about my latest book and then to talk about the future of the church. I got this invitation from the church my father had built in Wichita, and to a bunch of people who had known me since I was very small. They had watched me grow up, and that makes any kind of pretense much more difficult. One woman in particular, Elaine Nye, was my piano teacher. During a workshop portion of the meeting in which I asked people to imagine the kind of church that would be irresistible to them, Elaine came to the microphone, but she began by saying, "I was Robin's piano teacher. He did not always practice." And the whole place erupted in laughter. My mother did the best she could. She made me pay for my lessons when I did not practice, but nothing worked. I learned one song, which I can play, called "Poor Lonesome Cowboy." That was my entire musical career. But it just wasn't in me to begin with. It wasn't me. At about the same time, however, I started writing poetry, all by myself, in a journal, and not for anyone to read, and not for a grade. I did this because I believed there was a writer in me from the beginning, but there was never a piano player. I wish I could play the piano. Other people wish they could write. What's nice is that the world has both kinds of people in it, and others who can bake bread and fix broken pipes and make children learn. Mozart, had all this music in his head. all those musical geniuses did. If they had not written it down as a kind of creative exorcism, it would have probably driven them mad. The problem comes, the poet may be saying to us, when we try to make something happen to please someone else, or to make something of ourselves based on listening to a voice that's not our own. This is what Walcott means, I believe, when he says that we have ignored that stranger for another. It has been there all along, but we didn't know how to recognize it because we think we're in charge of how our life will unfold. There's a deeper, truer life that's always running beneath the surface of what I call the habitual self. And sometimes in a moment of rare and even startling clarity, the true self meets the habitual self. The you that you've imagined yourself to be for so long will finally greet this other you, and both will smile in welcome. Be advised, the habitual self, the conscious public self, does not like competition. It has a schedule. It has a dress code. It has a way of maintaining the equilibrium of this public image so that no one out there will be confused about who we really are. Most of all, ourselves. When someone asks us how we're doing, we say, "Oh, I'm staying busy, very busy." Imagine if we said instead, "Oh, I don't know. Sometimes my real self wakes me up at night and invites my habitual self to break bread." That's why a question that's better than "how are you" is, how goes it with your soul? How goes it with your soul? Remember Whitman's line, "I believe in you, my soul. The other that I am must not debase itself to you, and you must not be abased to the other." Have you noticed how often poets assume that the most basic human experience is the tension between exile and homecoming? This is an essential religious idea in the best sense of the word, because there is slumbering in all of us a place called home. That's why Augustine said, "Our hearts are restless until they find rest in thee." In other words, we should never forget that we did not make ourselves, and that for all the ways in which we wander, we are always being called home, to a place, as the Quran puts it, that is as close as the veins in our neck, and yet somehow elusive. Sometimes I think this essence is most fully present in children and even in teenagers, although they often seem to be on another planet because they're not yet fatigued by the making and maintaining of some habitual self. Their world is still fogged over by their dreams and by their immediately accessible emotions. We experience them as volatile, teenagers, and even incomprehensible, but they see themselves as misunderstood. "You just don't get me," they say. I gave the eulogy for a beloved kindergarten teacher in Oklahoma City on Friday. She had taught thousands of fortunate students, and the funeral was a homecoming, a remembrance of what was true in her and what she made true in us. Even her own children, now middle-aged, were on the verge of tears because at its best, life is a homecoming. It is a recognition of what we were given before we knew it that makes us into the human beings we have always been. Walcott puts it in the metaphors of communion. Give wine, give bread. This is not just a joyous communion with the divine, but with yourself, with the life that knows you by heart, knows every twist and turn that you've made, and the stupid things you have done. It contains everything that you are, including your alienation. We all wander off, but then without exile, there is no homecoming. So remember what Rumi said, straying maps the path. We can all become too comfortable doing and being what other people want us to do and be. So Walcott urges us to take down the love letters from the bookshelf, the photographs, the desperate notes, because these can sometimes be like a veil of loss, fed by old memories that keep us hidden from ourselves. We should not go looking for ourselves as if this is some former version of ourselves we will find. Rather, we should look for signs that what we really are will one day pass us in the hall and turn and say, "Is that you?" And we will respond startled, "No, you are me." A therapist told the story of a troubled client who confessed one day that he had a dream in which he met himself coming and going. But instead of comforting him, the therapist said, "Well, I hope you invited yourselves to dinner." It was strange for me to revisit my father's church all those years ago, the one that everyone assumed I would take over right after I was ordained, like father, like son. But that is not who I am. This is who I am. I didn't think I'd end up in Norman either. How strange is life? Yesterday I spent some time in one of my favorite places on earth, my backyard. Raking leaves, which I have long considered to be a spiritual activity, picking up the trash that had blown in from New Mexico in that frightening cyclone of wildfires on Friday, fixing a few things that were broken, and as I saw my own father do countless times growing up, hosing down the driveway so it can be clean, so it can get dirty again. I will turn 73 on Thursday, and as you all know, aging is something of an astonishment, as in, how did this happen? But this much is certain. In the waning days we have left, it might be wise to see that the reunion of the self and the soul is the essential religious journey. Or, as the poet puts it this morning, the time will come when, with elation, you'll greet yourself arriving at your own door, in your own mirror, and each will smile at the other's welcome and say, "Sit here, eat." Now is the time to feast on your life. May it be so. Amen.